So thank you so much for joining us so far. And we have two great breakout sessions for you to choose from. The other one is implementing telehealth with providers and patients. Anna Sanchez and Adele White from Community Health will explore how they implemented telehealth in their clinic. And the other session that you are in now is called the Good Samaritan Act and FTCA, which is a federal program that covers malpractice insurance. In this, Aileen Brooks of Malecki Brooks Law Group will cover the Good Samaritan Act, and Crystal Hogue, Executive Director of Champaign County Christian Health Center, will explain how her clinic has FTCA coverage for their providers. If you're just tuning in, we've had a lot of great conversations so far, and this one's going to be great too. So it is my pleasure to now turn things over to Crystal, who will start us off.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure, and I hope that all of you have been enjoying the presentation so far. And I am a board member of IAFCC as well as a committee member. So I'm so glad that you guys tuned in to our presentation. So I also want to talk about me. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen and share information about what we're going to be doing and presenting in our presentation. Just a second here. All right, so here we go. Okay, so about me, my name is Crystal Hogue, and I am the Executive Director of Champaign County Christian Health Center, also known as CCCHC. Get kind of tongue-tied there all the time. It's actually located in Champaign, Illinois, a population of over 209,000. We are a free clinic and serve the uninsured and also the underinsured patients in our community. So I am so thankful to be able to share information about the Federal Torts Claim Act from a clinic's perspective to other clinics who may not know the importance of having medical malpractice liability coverage, also known as the Federal Torts Claim Act, FTCA. I think it's important that every clinic understands the importance of having coverage and, of course, about the Good Samaritan Act. So in part one, we'll be talking about the Federal Torts Claim Act and what it's all about. And then, of course, in part two, we'll talk about the Good Samaritan Act. So in part one, what clinics need to know about the FTCA and the Good Samaritan Act. So what are the requirements? Why do clinics need this coverage? What is covered? What are the requirements to maintain coverage for my clinic? Why the FTCA? So I'm glad you guys asked that question. So what is the Federal Torts Claim Act? So the Federal Torts Claim Act, FTCA, enacted in 1946, provides the legal mechanism for compensating people who have suffered personal injury due to the alleged negligent or wrongful action of employees of the U.S. government. Through the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, HIPAA, which everyone should be familiar with HIPAA, Congress extended the ability for volunteer health professionals at qualifying free clinics to be deemed as federal employees, that's us as clinics, for purposes of medical malpractice liability coverage under the FTCA. Money was later appropriated for this program in 2004, and the first set of free clinic volunteers was deemed in 2005. In 2010, the Affordable Care Act expanded the availability of deeming to employees, officers, board members, and contractors of qualifying free clinics. So as we look at this, the Federally Supported Health Centers, FTCA HRSA Assistance Act of 1992 and 1995 granted medical malpractice liability protection through the FTCA to HRSA supported health centers. And so we'll get more involved in the HRSA. The Health Resources and Services Administration, HRSA, HRSA, an agency of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, is a primary federal agency for improving healthcare to people who are geographically isolated, economically, or medically vulnerable. And I'm sure that some of you out there can relate to the type of patients that you serve fall in these categories. Under the Act, health centers are considered federal employees and are immune from lawsuits with the federal government acting as their primary insurer. Okay, so the FTCA program. The Free Clinics FTCA program extends medical malpractice liability coverage under the FTCA to individuals who meet program and statutory requirements and are deemed as federal employees for such purposes. This saves free clinics the money used on medical malpractice insurance premiums and allows clinics to invest more in healthcare services and fund quality improvement activities. So we don't want to spend so much time on trying to have the funds available for something like this that's already covered for you for free, rather focusing on improving the activities of our clinic. So now I'd like to share a short video that I want to make sure that this is going to give you a summary of the FTCA volunteer coverage.
Hello, everyone. My name is Info. I am your friendly FTCA guide. Today, I want to talk to you about some very exciting news. Volunteer health professionals working at FTCA-deemed health centers are now eligible for medical malpractice liability protection under the FTCA. Let's get right to the details about what's covered and how you can apply for coverage. As you all know, FTCA medical malpractice liability coverage is extended to governing board members, officers, employees, and certain individual contractors of FTCA-covered entities, such as health centers that receive Section 330 funds and have been deemed as employees of the Public Health Service. Historically, FTCA coverage has not been available to health center volunteers. However, through the enactment of the 21st Century Cures Act, liability protections are now available to volunteer health professionals, also known as VHPs, for the performance of medical, surgical, dental, and related functions at health centers that are FTCA deemed. But wait, coverage is not available to volunteers just by virtue of that legislation. There is a deeming process for health centers that wish to sponsor volunteers for deemed employee status. The FTCA VHP program is separate from the FTCA Health Center program and requires a separate deeming process for volunteers. Eligible health center VHPs do not receive deemed PHS employee status automatically, nor do they receive it simply by volunteering at the health center. Instead, health centers must submit an annual application for deeming on behalf of each of their individually named VHPs to HRSA. So, sponsoring health centers may now begin submitting supplemental applications through the electronic handbooks for deemed status for volunteers at their health center. The application will not require all of the standard information that must be submitted with initial and/or redeeming applications, but rather, sponsoring health centers will be asked to attest that the health center has maintained its credentialing, privileging, and risk management systems. For each volunteer health professional, you will be required to answer various questions and provide documents. Before you go, here are some important coverage requirements to note in preparation of submitting your application. 1. Only a deemed health center may sponsor volunteer health professionals. 2. Volunteer health professionals are eligible to receive the same liability protections as employees, qualified contractors, governing board members, and officers. And 3, similar to regular health center initial and redeeming, sponsoring health centers must continue to adhere to credentialing and privileging, quality improvement, quality assurance, risk management, and claims management requirements. We know that was a lot of information in a short amount of time, but don't worry. Complete guidance, including coverage and application requirements, can be found in the VHP Program Assistance Letter and the VHP Deeming webcast that aired on August 31st, 2017. Both are available on the FTCA VHP website. As always, if you have any questions, please contact the BIPIC helpline at 1-877-974-2742, option 2, or via their web form. The phone line is available from 8 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Monday through Friday, except federal holidays. Thank you for watching.
Okay, so I hope that information was helpful for you, and I hope that you were taking notes about that. So let's move on. So as far as the healthcare services that the clinics offer, here are just some tips about this. The healthcare services must be free, should not, when providing health services to the facility, accept reimbursement from any third-party payer, including reimbursement under any insurance policy or health plan or under any federal state health benefits program, but may accept volunteer donations for the provision of services. And in providing health services to the facility, does not impose charges on the individuals to whom services are being provided, or imposes a charge according to the ability of the individual involved to pay the charge. And also, of course, is licensed or certified in accordance with applicable law regarding the provision of health services. All right, so what are the requirements for the health professionals? What's the requirements for your providers? Provide services to patients at a free clinic or through off-site programs or events carried out by the free clinic. I know that we've had several events sometimes for health fairs and workshops that involved our providers, so they were covered. Be sponsored by the free clinic, as sponsorship is further defined by the statute. Provide a qualifying health service, medical assistance required or authorized to be provided under Title 19 of the Social Security Act, without regard to whether the medical assistance is included in the plan submitted under this program by the state in which the healthcare practitioner provides the service. Continuing on, does not receive compensation, and neither does the free clinic, because we're free. They're providing for free. They're volunteering for free for providing services from patients directly or from any third-party payer, including reimbursement from any insurance policy, health plan, or under any federal or state health benefits program. May receive repayment from a free clinic for reasonable expenses. Those reasonable expenses, I'm pretty much not sure what those are. Could be maybe for a dentist that needs medical or a provider that needs medical supplies. Incurred in several provision to patients. Of course, is licensed or certified to provide healthcare services at the time of service provision in accordance with applicable law, and also provides patients with written notification before service provision of the extent to which his or her legal liability is limited pursuant to the PHS Act, if his or her associated free clinic has not already provided such notification. So as we look further at this, the program requirements, credentialing and privileging system. There is a part in the application process, and I'll get into a little further, where they have to make sure that the providers are credentialed and they're privileged. In the system, there's also quality insurance improvement, which is also called the QI and QA program. That's included in the section in the risk management system. What I've done in the past was have some of the nurses, there was one in particular who was an APN that submitted a quality assurance report based on a diabetic patient that we had in the system, and we were able to use that information, upload it into the system there. Disclosure of medical malpractice claims and professional disciplinary actions, as well as annual data reporting. And I can't express enough how important data is. And listening to Nicole today about data, it's so important that we gather the data that we need for our clinics. So credentialing and privileging. Providers is an important aspect of quality assurance and risk management. It is important for each free clinic to maintain a level of professionalism and quality in their providers in order to ensure that each provider is properly licensed and is able to complete or competently perform every procedure expected of them. Providers need to be credentialed and privileged every two years. So I hope that you guys are double checking on the IDPFR system to make sure that the providers are renewing their license. Other coverages needed. The program does not provide protection for anything beyond medical malpractice coverage. For instance, it does not cover incidents normally protected by general liability. Directors or officers' insurance policies. Free clinics should consult with their insurance agents to determine their needs for protection beyond the program. So how does one qualify for coverage? How? So to qualify for coverage, an initial deeming application is submitted to the U.S. Department of Health Services. After acceptance, annual redeeming takes place. And this is where it kind of gets a little tricky here. There is some work that's involved in submitting your application. So what is that FTCA application process? What does it look like for us as a clinic that you might be thinking? Well, as a person that runs a clinic, I have to go in and make sure that the applications are uploaded. We have to add all the providers in. If you have between 10 to 20 providers, you still have to go in and add those providers into the system to make sure that they're in the system. So the process itself is not a difficult one. It's not really hard. It's just, of course, following the checklist and making sure that you have everyone that's part of the clinic that should be added in the application added. Once the clinic is approved as a whole, an initial deeming takes place for all volunteers, including the board and staff. Basic information, a copy of their medical license is uploaded to the server and other documents, policies, and procedures. So as you're looking at the HRSA review process, once all have been added, a review process from HRSA would take place. And then a letter, of course, is sent to the clinic with a listing of all of those added. Subsequently, as new volunteers arrive, they can be added individually. And that's something that I know I do that periodically. I just added a nurse to our team. So I had to go in and add her on through a supplemental application, which I don't talk about in this presentation, but that's information that you can find on the website. But I had to go in and add her on. It takes about 1 to 2 weeks to process. And so they will add her on as a new nurse to our team. Redeeming the application. So the clinic must redeem each of the volunteers and resubmit the requested documentation annually. While it can take a bit of time to upload the needed documents, ultimately the benefit this provides outweighs any time that it may take. So that's why I cannot stress the importance of, if you don't have the coverage, to make sure that you go in and add all of your providers on there. Okay, so why clinics need to enroll their volunteers? So why is this important? As Jeff was talking about, what is the why? Why is it important? It's because it's a free service. So why wouldn't we do this? As a free clinic, why wouldn't we do this if it's offered to us? So it's a free service. You want the additional layer of coverage. If someone tried to sue the clinic or a specific provider, they are excused from liability. FTCA steps in to cover the legal fees associated with it. And so what is the real benefit? It's a benefit to our volunteers in the recruiting process. When you're interviewing your providers, they ask about coverage and so forth. You can talk to them about, well, there's this additional layer of coverage. We'll add you on to the application process and so on. Peace of mind for providers given the fear associated with volunteering their specialties at a small clinic without the backing of a large hospital malpractice lab policy behind them. So that's the redeeming process. This is just like some photos of our clinic before COVID. We were at the OSF Center. This is the resource center. We were there for about 5 years. Patient waiting area there. And now we're doing a fundraiser because we do not have a building. We're actually offering telehealth services right now. And this is our CCCH team, all covered under the FTCA. Nurses, doctors, our dental team, all covered under the FTCA. So this ends part 1 of my presentation. And then now we're going to turn it over to Ms. Brooks, who's going to talk about the Good Samaritan Act. And if you have any questions for us about the FTCA, feel free to put it in the Q&A, and I'll also have links and resources available for you as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to present to you today regarding the Good Samaritan Act. My name is Aileen Brooks. I am also a member of the IAFCC board. I'm a fairly new member of the board. My background is as an attorney, but I'm also a registered nurse and practiced as a registered nurse for many, many years. My law firm, Alecki Brooks Law Group, we have about 14 attorneys that specialize in healthcare law. We have many clients, including free and charitable clinics, FQHCs, hospitals, hospices, various practice groups. So today we're going to talk about the Good Samaritan Act, specifically in Illinois. I always need to include this disclaimer saying that this doesn't constitute legal advice or legal opinion. This is for educational purposes only. And if you have or require any specific legal advice or have any specific legal questions, please consult with your attorney. So the key presentation objectives today are to give you a general overview of the Good Samaritan Act, to provide you with the legal criteria to obtain exemption from civil liability for providers who work in free medical clinics, and also to explain some of the requirements that a clinic has to post about the fact that you are covered under the Good Samaritan Act, and explain the exemption to patients. Briefly, when I looked up the definition of good in preparation for this talk, it talked about having the qualities required for a particular role. And this is important because one of the criteria for coverage under the Good Samaritan Act is that you act in good faith and reasonably. So the definition seems to make sense. The other word, Samaritan, is defined as someone who's charitable or a helpful person. So taken together, someone who renders on a voluntary basis, renders aid, is considered a good Samaritan. So what's the purpose of the act? To protect citizens who volunteer their time and talent, to encourage people to volunteer their time and talent, to help indigent patients or underinsured patients or patients that can't otherwise obtain care elsewhere. The statute also talks about it should be liberally construed to encourage people to volunteer their time. And of course, in volunteering your time, you might have a concern about, are you going to be liable if something happens to that patient while they're in your care? So under the act, you can obtain an exemption from civil liability and from damages unless your conduct or behavior is willful and wanton. And I included a definition here of willful and wanton, and meaning a reckless disregard for the safety of the patient, failure to exercise ordinary care. I would take this to mean something that really that you're not qualified, trained, don't have any clue what it is you're doing, just kind of a reckless disregard or a dangerous act. So unless your behavior is so awful that it's willful or wanton, then you should have coverage or expect coverage under the act. So what professionals are covered by the act? Interesting, the act includes a lot of, it specifically lists a lot of different providers. It lists dentists, it lists free dental clinics, it lists physicians, advanced practice providers such as registered nurse and physician assistants, nurses, pharmacists, optometrists, physical therapists, podiatrists. It also talks about things like people who render first aid that have some Red Cross training. It talks about people who use the AEDs. If you're properly trained in how to use an AED, you could be covered under the Act. For people who try to rescue choking victims that might work in the food industry, they're covered under the Act. Or people who render CPR who have had training in CPR. So it's pretty broad in terms of the types of professionals that are covered under the Act. So does it apply to the providers in the free clinic? Yes, it absolutely does. It specifically mentions providers licensed under the Medical Practice Act. So this would be physicians or other who may be licensed in either in the state of Illinois or another state. But it also covers, as I said, other healthcare professionals such as APRNs, physician assistants, nurses, and others. And again, the requirement of acting in good faith, providing treatment, diagnosis, or advice. And they're doing so as part of an established free clinic that's providing care to medically indigent patients or underserved patients. And also, as mentioned earlier by Ms. Hoke, about not receiving any fee or compensation from that source or from that patient. We'll talk a little bit about more about that in a second. So does the Act apply to the free clinic itself? So the Act covers the providers, the individuals that are providing the care to the patient. It does not cover the clinic. So if there is something that happened, unexpected occurrence, some poor outcome as a result of the act or omission of that provider would have civil immunity from liability. However, the clinic does not, which is why it's important that the clinic either obtain the FTCA coverage or they have other insurance available to them to cover what might have happened in those circumstances. So the Act does not bar a cause of action against an entity or doesn't change the liability of that entity, meaning the free clinic, from the acts of the person or the providers. So what's a free medical clinic? Probably most of you know that, are very familiar with it. It's one that's organized, a community-based program that's providing medical care without charge to people who are unable to pay for it, or it could be a local health department community care clinic. So is a charitable clinic a free clinic? Not necessarily, but charitable clinics can qualify as free clinics under the Act, and they have to meet the same criteria. And that includes things like that they're not billing the patients for the service, they're not billing the insurance company for the services, and they're not paying the providers for a fee for the care that they provided. So to qualify for immunity from civil liability for the providers, the clinic has a requirement. They have to post a sign saying in a very conspicuous place that explaining the exemption from civil liability. So I'm assuming most of you have that already posted within your clinic in some conspicuous place for patients to see it. I'm also assuming some of you will have forms that you would ask the patients to sign, acknowledging the fact that you are a free and charitable clinic and that the providers are providing free services, and that as such, they're immune from liability under the Good Samaritan Act. For those of you who have free clinicals without actual, or free clinics without actual physical premises, and this might be some of these outreach services or something where you have a kind of a pop-up or a little event, you don't need to physically post it, but you need to have some kind of written document. And the statute is very specific. It has to be 14-point bold type. And it has to be provided to the patient, or have the patients, if it's a minor, have the guardian of the patient sign it. It can be signed by either the patient or a member of the clinic, but there is some acknowledgement that this is a free clinic that's providing the services in order to achieve the immunity from liability under the Act. So one of the questions that comes up sometimes is whether the clinic can accept contributions for the medical services. They absolutely can, but the criteria for that are, it's a patient who may be a grateful patient who is willing to pay a portion of the value of the services. You haven't asked them specifically to pay for it. You haven't billed them for it, but they say, yes, I'd like to contribute something towards the care that you provided to me. And then whatever funds might be received on that basis can only be used to pay overhead expenses for operating the clinic. So it can't be used to pay a fee or provide other compensation to the providers that are providing care to the clinic. So in review, medical professionals licensed under the Act or other licensed by other states and other providers, as we've discussed, such as RNs or nurses or podiatrists or dentists, can receive immunity from civil liability under the Act, as long as they meet all of the criteria that we've discussed. So that includes providing treatment in good faith. And I would say good faith meaning within the scope of your practice, with your within your experience, your knowledge, your capabilities, and that you're not doing something that you just completely don't know how to do or have never done before. So limiting it to current standards of care and maybe protocols or procedures that are established. The services have to be provided at a free clinic without fee. And again, as I explained, you could accept some funds from a patient, but they have to be used for operational purposes. The providers cannot be paid. And again, the liability is only so good as the person acting in good faith, and they're not engaging in some form of misconduct that's willful or wanton or in reckless disregard for the well-being of the patient. And it is civil liability. So for example, if there were some kind of criminal complaint or something of assault, let's say, sometimes there are those types of allegations, those types of things would not be covered under the Act. One other thing to point out under the Act is just because you have, as a provider, civil immunity, it doesn't mean you won't get sued. It doesn't mean you can't get sued. So by that, I mean, someone could name you in a lawsuit and say that you provided care, you didn't meet the standard of care, as a result of your actions, they were somehow injured. So they could bring a lawsuit against you. And then your defense to that lawsuit, and what they call an affirmative defense, would be that you are immune from liability because you provided the services under the terms of the Good Samaritan Act and that you met all these criteria. So I know some people think that means you can't get sued or you're not going to be sued. And just to be clear, that there's still that potential, but you would have this defense as long as you've met all the requirements set forth in the Act. So I hope that explains the Act in a nutshell. Thank you for your time and attention. And I think we're going to have some time to take questions.
If anybody has any questions for Crystal or Aileen, please put them in the Q&A. And we have about 10-ish minutes to answer them.
And as we're thinking about this, I will say that I heard a question about the, I just posted some resources in the chat box, but they have questions about telehealth being covered. I heard, I believe it was Nicole, someone had asked her a question about that. And there is something that's listed under the determination of coverage for FTCA. And it's on their website under COVID-19. So I would encourage you, I did provide that link here. It does talk about where I believe that telehealth services would be covered, but there's reasons why, or there's information that you'll have to look through to make sure that you're abiding by, because I know it's listed all under COVID-19. So I did provide a link that you could actually click that link for more information and find out if your clinic would be eligible. And I can also read information if you guys wanted to hear that. I can go through that really quickly here. That it talks about, oh, there's a question?
Yes, we have a couple questions.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you're totally fine. So she said, her question is, can you give us an idea of how much time it takes for your clinic to complete all the required paperwork, considering the number of volunteer providers and staff that you have?
That's a good question. Thanks for asking that, because usually it takes a couple of hours to do it. If you're really committed, maybe between 2 to 3 hours that day. And we have about 10 providers, so I'd have to go in and make sure I add every provider listed on there, as well as nurses, anyone that has licenses or certifications. They do ask that you upload that information. So it takes a couple of hours to do it. So again, it doesn't take long to do it. It's just once you do it, you're covered if you're approved for it. But there is a qualifying process that you would have to go through first. Once you go through that process, and then it appears that your clinic and your providers are eligible for the coverage, then you would go in and add the information in. I hope that answers your question.
And then there's one more for you also. Did you need a lawyer to help you figure out the RSA or BPHC paperwork initially?
No, and I guess because there's so much of wealth information on the website, that's why I would encourage you to visit the website, click on the links. There's FAQ questions listed there that will be able to answer the question that you have for your clinic. Even just the information about the COVID, about is it covered? Because right now we're not operating in a physical location. So the website is very, very, it's a very good resource. So I would encourage you to go ahead to the website and find out information, go to the search. You can also contact them as well. If you call them, they'll be able to give you information as well. But I would encourage you, if you've been thinking about it, to go ahead, and as Ms. Brooks mentioned about the Good Samaritan Act, that's there. But for the FTCA, you still have to go through the process in order to add your providers on there for that additional layer of coverage.
Awesome. Any more questions?
So if there's no more questions, I will go through and read this paragraph that I did discover for that. It says that FTCA coverage under or during the COVID-19 pandemic for the provision of qualifying health services by individuals who have been deemed, this is of course going through that process, as public health service employees to the Free Clinics FTCA program. It applies to qualifying health services to prevent, prepare, or respond to COVID-19, including but not limited to screening, triage, testing, diagnosis, and treatment to individuals who are established or non-established patients of the Free Clinic, whether in person at the Free Clinic through responsive offsite programs or events carried out by the Free Clinic or via telehealth. So that's listed there, so that's good. So yes, I would encourage you guys, if you've been thinking about doing it, to go ahead and get your providers added. Any other questions for us?
We still have about 2 more minutes. So if you have any questions, you can just throw them in the Q&A and we can answer those.
And as we're thinking about that too, I will say also that you will be notified once you submit the application, once you go through the deeming process, you will be notified via email. So you won't miss it, and you have to renew every year. Usually it's around the summer, August, September, to start that process again. Again, as I mentioned before, if you do add a new provider, make sure that you immediately go in and add that person under the supplemental application in the HRSA EHB, which is the electronic handbook section of the website. And it usually takes about 1 to 2 weeks before they send you out a letter. Usually it's via email. In fact, I just got one yesterday. We had just added a nurse, registered nurse in the system. So if you,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, once you verify that the nurse or the provider is covered in the IDPFR system, then you can actually attach a copy of that into the application as well. So that will expedite the process, because if you don't attach it, then they'll ask for it, and that's going to delay it. So,
and we have one more question. Lalitha said one of their challenges at her clinic is volunteering by employed physicians. Can you shine some light on that?
Volunteering by the employed physicians, as far as Because of the coverage, the lack of not knowing it because you're a small clinic, or what? I know that with some of the, I'm trying to think of some experience I've had with some physicians who work for the big hospitals, because we are a small clinic, they want to verify their time with us, but they also want to make sure that they're covered too. So I think the importance of explaining that if they were to volunteer for your clinic, to talk about that they're covered, you know, the ways that they're covered through the Good Samaritan Act as well as the FTCA. And so I think that's it. It's really getting them interested in what you're doing, and how talking about also that you have other providers that have also volunteered their time. If you've had that, I've seen that's been very helpful for us. As I talk about Carl and Christie and McKinley, all the hospitals around here, there's maybe a couple of doctors from each healthcare facility that's volunteering their time after work to volunteer at our clinic. And so I'm constantly recruiting people. I'm constantly getting people to volunteer to help serve in the community. And that's really a rewarding experience. So I hope I answered your question. I tend to get all over the place at times. So I hope that answered your question.
I would probably add as well, if they are employed, if the provider is employed by a big hospital system, it might be pursuant to an employment contract. And oftentimes the employment contract will have a provision in it about whether they're able to volunteer their time or not, whether they have to obtain permission from the hospital to provide medical services outside the scope of their employment. And many of those contracts will have a provision in them saying that their insurance that the hospital provides does not cover them for anything outside the scope of their employment. So for example, if the hospital is encouraging them to volunteer at the clinic and will provide that coverage and knows they're going there, great. If not, then we need to look at the FTCA or the Good Samaritan Act.
Absolutely. And I know that as an example for that, we did have a psychologist that was kind of concerned if he would be covered or not. But because he worked for the hospital, they have a policy where if you're volunteering your time, then you are covered because you're volunteering your time. So that's even an additional layer on top of everything else, you know. So yeah. So that's good. So the coverage is out there. It's just getting them in there to help you guys. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Crystal and Aileen, for such a great conversation and for sharing all of that knowledge with us.